World leaders have welcomed a historic move by the US to end more than 50 years of hostility towards Cuba and restore diplomatic relations. Pope Francis joined leaders from Latin America and Europe in praising the historic deal which saw the release of prisoners from both countries. But dozens of dissident Cubans oppose the move, which some Republicans have labeled a retreat by the US. US-Cuban ties have been frozen since the early 1960s. President Obama said the rigid and outdated policy of isolating Cuba since then had clearly failed and that it was time for a new approach. Mr Castro, meanwhile, has urged the US to end its trade embargo, which has been in place since the Cuba turned to communism more than 50 years ago. But power to lift the embargo, which Mr Castro says has caused enormous human and economic damage, lies with the US Congress, and correspondents say many Republicans are still deeply opposed to this beginning of the end. Leading the praise, Pope Francis sent warm congratulations to Mr Obama and Cuban President Raúl Castro for overcoming the difficulties which have marked their recent history. The announcement followed more than a year of secret talks in Canada and at the Vatican, directly involving the pontiff. The European Union, which is in the process of normalizing ties with Cuba, described the move as a historical turning point, while leaders meeting at a Latin America summit in Argentina broke into applause at the news. Chilean Foreign Minister Geraldo Muñoz hailed it as the beginning of the end of the Cold War in the Americas. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, whose predecessor Hugo Chavez was a close ally of Fidel Castro, said it was a moral victory and victory for Fidel. Former U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said increased U.S. engagement in Cuba in the future should encourage real and lasting reforms for the Cuban people, and the other nations of the Americas should join us in this effort, she added. The Canadian Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, whose country never broke off ties with Cuba, welcomed what he called the overdue development. But the move was not applauded by everyone, with dozens of Cubans living in exile in the U.S. state of Florida protesting after the announcement on Wednesday. It is a betrayal. The talks are only going to benefit Cuba, Carlos Muñoz Fontanil said at a protest in Miami's Colecho. Meanwhile, Republican Senator Marco Rubio slammed the deal as inexplicable, adding that it did nothing to address the issues of Cuba's political system and human rights record. Cuban bloggers' reaction. There were people who cried and those who did not believe what was happening. This change was something long awaited by those who were born in the midst of a long-standing war that we did not ask for or want. Alejandro Rodriguez. Most people reacted with joy and hope. The coming days will show the real scope of the measures, but for now the streets exude optimism. Contrary to what uninformed people may believe, Cubans do not harbor anti-American sentiments. Uris Norido. There were signs and indications that this big story did not come out of nowhere. Now it is time for civil society to deepen the struggle to establish a genuine state with a proper rule of law. Regina Coelho. As part of the deal, U.S. contractor Alan Gross, 65, was released from Cuban prison in return for 3 Cubans held in the U.S. President Obama said the U.S. was looking to open an embassy in Havana in the coming months. Officials said that Mr. Obama and Mr. Castro spoke by telephone on Tuesday for nearly an hour, the first presidential-level talks between the two nations since Cuba's 1959 revolution. In exchange for Mr. Gross, who was in poor health, and an unnamed American intelligence officer, Washington released 3 members of the so-called Cuban Five who are serving lengthy sentences for espionage. Mr. Gross's 5-year imprisonment had undermined previous attempts to thaw diplomatic relations between the two countries.